There is no conflict.
Hello everyone, Flame here. In this episode, I will make some comments and observation on rationality rules talking about sex and gender. Steven has Forrest on again, and Steven only mildly challenges him. Not nearly enough if you ask me. So I will address the things I think Steven was missing. The video is 2 hours long, so I will skip a lot not to make this more than that. For one, I think gender is an useful concept since it clearly does reflect to objective reality. Evolution creates a lot of variation, so it is no wonder that some don't feel like they were born in a correct body. A lot of time was spent on making arguments for this position, and I will skip all of that since I mostly accept it. It's no fun if I just agree, right? You can always refer to the original video. One of the problems that I keep encountering is Forrest can never keep the story straight. He seems to confuse everything. Sex, gender expression. He just jumps around and his reasoning sounds completely mad. I'm expecting to get objection of course he didn't mean like how you took it. But I've listened this for dozens of times and it's still not clear to me. He is such a bad communicator. I know it may sound strange for people who are taken in by his ability to just keep talking. But if you have to make a video and listen to his words over and over, you start to realize that this ability to talk a lot immediately is created by a messy flow. It is like how I am if I drink coffee. Under influence, I think I'm more quick thinking, but results are worse when I look at them afterwards. It's like he is in constant spiked state and believes he is talking perfect sense and convincing others he is speaking perfect sense, thanks to the confidence it gives, but is just being extremely sloppy at every turn. Also, I will try to skip most parts where Forrest just spends endless amounts of time just berating everyone who has a different opinion. I already made a video about that. You can refer to that if you want. This video is no different. Forrest is still as slimy as ever, but I will have to adjust my tone from the last video. I will reflect energy. I won't berate Steven as much because he isn't being a dick, but I will feel no remorse laying it on Forrest. If I keep this completely nice and tidy, it doesn't really give the weight on how badly Forrest is acting and how bad his ideas really are. So I might end up wasting a few extra words on adding exclamation marks, but I think they are needed to hammer home how outrageous some of the stuff he says really is. With that said, let's start.
Beginning, what was our ancestors' understanding of sex? What was their views? So there's a lot that we do and don't know. It's very likely that their concept of sex would have just been totally limited to their external phenotype, just whatever they could see with their eyes. But even in that, there's a lot of variation. And so they might have just gone with external genitalia. They might have gone with secondary sex characteristics. It's hard to say. What we do know for sure is that we do see like gendered behaviors and gendered roles and different treatments of different people and across, history and culture. But as far as like what they actually thought about biological sex, it's hard to know if they had that concept or if they conflated sex and gender as one solid thing, although that's exceedingly unlikely.
We are just 5 minutes into the video and I'm just wondering what the fuck is this? Our ancestors didn't have concept of biological sex. Do you mean they didn't write textbooks about it? Or that they didn't realize that there were any differences between males and females? It sounds so bonkers that he must be again mixing gender into it even when that wasn't even asked. Question was about our ancestors' view of sex. Not gender, and not gender expression or anything like that. I can't believe he means that humans had no idea of male and female. If this is not evident for you, I can prove this right now without referring to any books. I provide as evidence, you, the listener. What happens when you see a person? Your inner instinctual heuristic immediately makes a sex determination of the person you are seeing. Yes, Forrest, I know it happens to you too. You can't help it. It happens. When you are not sure which sex, you get an uncanny feeling. Well, what is the need to know? Usually nothing, but it's so deep inside you that you just can't help it. Next, I will make an educated guess that we are not that different from our ancestors few thousand years ago based on how slow evolution is. And even so, I would claim it should be quite obvious that this is quite common in other species as well.
One of the main questions that we're interested in is what kind of information do these bad vocalizations convey? These are what we call the time signal of the vocalizations, and then the machine will process each sequence, and down here we will see the decoding, what was the context of the interaction. Okay, so the machine is processing, and this was an interaction about food.
It is quite advantageous to know who you can mate with. So I predict we had this before we were even humans. So they had this same intuition, and that is how they primarily differentiated sex. If that wasn't enough, then pants down also does the trick. Now ask yourself, how many times this intuition has been wrong in your life? If you have more than a minute to look at someone, how often you guess their sex wrong? And Forrest is saying that there is just so much variation in just recognizing what you see. This is what means to be clouded in bias.
All you're showing is that you are incapable of stepping outside of your own heuristics for even a second to check to see if you have any biases or check to see if you're actually wrong.
There is no way he would have said these things unless he has modern issues on mind while thinking about this subject as well. He quickly said the most obvious thing, and after that immediately started to paint over the picture to make it more fuzzy. You think it is highly unlikely that they had sex and gender being the same? Actually, I think the complete opposite is true. I find it very likely that they were very binary on the issue. What happened to a lot of kids? Well, they died. Child mortality was much higher than today. If there was famine and conflict on who should survive, do you think they will save the odd one that doesn't have working reproductive organs? The detection heuristic probably was working even better then than today. What I'm offering is reasoning and evidence, while Forrest just confidently says things. I can't relate to this mode he is on at all.
Our own culture. We look back across, Western society, and there was a time when men would wear powder makeup to make their skin white and put on beauty marks and wear powdered wigs. It was manly for a man to faint and swoon and weep with emotion. All things that certainly wouldn't be considered super manly in 1960s America.
You can find instances like this in the history for sure. But let's examine this. You are referring to 17th and 18th century France, where nobility did this. Now let me ask you a question. Do you think most of the population was like this? Do you think in the lower classes they saw positively men who used makeup or wept with emotion? You really think the peasants were doing this? And those were the majority? Kind of like in modern times. We are all upper class compared to people in history. That is why we can afford behavior that doesn't flow naturally from what we are. If times were harder, there is no way Forrest would be talking like this, because it would not sell to anyone. Reality would be hitting the faces of listeners all the time that Forrest is simply full of shit. What the peasants would think is, that is just the talk of the privileged snob who knows nothing. The point I'm driving here is that you are losing the big picture when you use exceptions to inform your thinking. There really is a biological and survival drive that informs gender expression in a very powerful way. So that to this day, women don't see men who cry as attractive. The nobility could afford it, the peasants can't.
So, with what you were saying there, that comes down to an internal part of the debate, and that is whether or not children specifically can give consent. And that, to me, is one of the more difficult parts of the conversation, because in general, I don't think that children can give consent. And I actually have a different view for trans boys versus trans girls. And it comes down to the fact that if you transition, if you've got a boy and the boy is really exhibiting gender dysphoria and they're leaning towards, it's explicit, you've had it tested, there's people there, and it seems really clear that this person is transgender. My view is that you probably do need to intervene before puberty, because it makes such a big difference with the plates fusing. Puberty is very aggressive on the typical male. And so intervening quickly is something that really needs to be considered. And let's say they are one of the very few people that, as they get older, they detransition. It's not really that difficult, because you can just, there's elements of it, but you can take testosterone and you will present as a typical male. Whereas with females, as soon as they start receiving the treatment, their voice is permanently altered. If they do certain changes to their bodies, it's very hard to fix those things. And so my current view, and it's not very well thought out, but my current view is that there's probably some nuance between the two there. I'm wondering what your thoughts are to that and how much you thought about that topic.
I wonder if Stephen is thinking about Chloe when he says this.
My name is Chloe Cole, and I am a detransitioner. Another way to put that would be, I used to believe that I was born in the wrong body, and the adults in my life whom I trusted affirmed my belief, and this caused me lifelong, irreversible harm. I speak to you today as a victim of one of the biggest medical scandals in the history of the United States of America. I speak to you in the hope that you will have the courage to bring the scandal to an end and ensure that other vulnerable teenagers, children, and young adults don't go through what I went through.
So I would push back on 2 points. Number one is that puberty blockers exist, and they exist for a reason, and they're safe and effective. And again, we like to pretend that this is something that only benefits trans people. Puberty blockers were made for cis children who are experiencing precocious puberty, early puberty that they don't want to have right then, and you want to push it back a little while to make sure they have a normal development with their peers. That's what those things were made for, and they're safe and effective in that situation as well. So like, if you're in a situation where you're saying, okay, this kid is experiencing severe gender dysphoria, and we're looking at the possibility of medical intervention, but we want to make sure they get old enough to really understand what they're getting into, okay, we have a way to do that. Again, there's no doctor just out there just lopping off body parts of every kid who's like, I think I want to be a boy today. That's not what we're doing. But like this is something that is, best medical practices backed by evidence, just like everything else in medicine right now. And like, so yeah, that's the first thing I would push back on, is like there are ways to work around the situation.
Just before you get to the second part, I think that's a great point. So like, I guess in my mind, because I'm like most people, I haven't thought about this enough. I come in it, I've got a bit of concern, but you're right. You don't have to just go for male, female levels of hormones. You can halt it. That's a fair point. Like, yeah, fair enough. I'm already convinced, but you said you got a second criticism.
Well, and the second,
I would be careful to talk so positively about puberty blockers. How could you know their true effects? This example is exaggerated, but I do it in order to make a point. Imagine a subject in two parallel world paths. In the natural world, they go through natural puberty, and in the blocker world, they use puberty blockers. What if in the natural world their IQ would have been 150, but in the blocker world it is only 100? Well, in the blocker world they would determine that the subject continued puberty normally, and that puberty blockers were safe to use. How could they know any better without the results from the other world? After all, both IQ levels are normal. Maybe it also could affect breast and penis sizes? Puberty is a very important time of development. Saying that blocking it and it will safely continue normally sounds very irresponsible to me. Some parts of the development might be missing, but how could you know? Also, there is talk about puberty blockers causing bone density issues. It is something that should be last resort and not talked so positively about with words like safe and effective.
the thing that I would say is that your main concern, you said you had a different set of rules for trans boys versus trans girls, and I would push back on that as sexist and reductionist, because what you're doing there is, you talked about a woman's voice is going to be permanently altered. Take into account the fact that it's a cultural thing that we value neoteny in females, and we want them to maintain as many prepubescent traits as possible and be high-pitched and hairless and short and britty and all these things. Like, that's an issue with male culture and sexualization. That's not an issue with females who are trans. You know what I mean?
So, yeah, no, so on paper, I completely agree with you.
I'm not calling you a sexist, by the way. I'm saying that particular view is rooted in that misogyny.
I totally agree with that. However, it's more of a practical and pragmatic perception. So part of looking into the whole trans stuff myself is to look at the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it. And if you watch detransition videos from particularly females that transition to a man and now they're back to women, the effects are just so obvious with a lot of them because of the testosterone, particularly with the voice, that they struggle every day in culture because of what you've just expressed. But the fact that I agree with you that it's wrong doesn't change the fact that the vast majority of people see that and then probably not going to get rid of it. So my view is more of a pragmatic one on that concern.
Good to hear Stephen pushing back on Forrest here, but I don't think that was nearly enough. What Forrest is saying here is not just stupid, but it is appalling as well. Does Forrest really think sexual attraction is simply arbitrary, and it is just misogynist to be attracted to feminine, high-pitched voice? This reminds me of the people who demand that men should find fat women attractive, or it is discriminatory. The feminine high-pitched voice is one of the tiny things how our internal heuristic detect a female. Most female have high-pitched voice, haven't you noticed? So saying that men should start finding any sound of voice attractive is never going to happen without a long evolutionary pressure. So let's just say, not within our lifetimes. And using this reasoning, Forrest is being so dismissive of these girls' plight. Yes, unfortunately, the truth is that they have become less attractive for most men when their voices change like this, and no name-calling, threats, or socialization is going to change that. Forrest is an idealist, and Stephen is trying to talk about pragmatic world, how it is out there. But it is worse than how the world currently is. It will never change to your utopia. Social constructs don't just pop out of nothing with no rhyme of reason, complete random. They reflect to something in reality. And what you are completely dismissing or ignoring are our innate instincts that were forged by eons of evolution. That is where your blind spot is. You are being too rational to see how our instincts still drive our wants and desires. You might be able to reason your way out of the ancestral path, but most can't or don't wish to do so. And even if you can reason your way out, I claim it will cause mental strain over longer periods of time. This is an assertion for now, but I will provide more evidence of this claim in time. Embracing the synergy of rationality and instinct is a path to wisdom, while forsaking the latter, especially over extended durations, is foolishness.
If you're a young boy with gynecomastia and you're starting to develop breast tissue, you're probably going to want to go have that excised to make sure that you look and feel more like a boy. That is gender-affirming care for a cisgendered male, and nobody bats an eye at that. But, when it's a trans kid, now all of a sudden, we're a bit more worried about it because, they can't make those decisions for themselves. Like, yeah, they can. And also, it's not like there's a doctor just walking down the hallway with a pair of hedge clippers, lopping off dongs of every kid who says he wants to be a girl. There's a long process of therapy and of doctors and psychologists and therapy, like all sorts of things that go into this. And it's backed. This is what gets me the most, is that every major medical association recognizes the importance, the life-saving importance of gender-affirming care for trans people of all ages, including trans youth. And again, just like we said a minute ago, it's only in this one weirdly politicized situation that we're pretending like the best scientists and doctors in the world don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Yeah, they're going to have to deal with that, and that's going to be a hard thing. But like when you bring up detransitioners for that, it's important to point out that the amount of trans people who detransition is exceedingly rare. Like that's a vanishingly small number. And amongst that number, vast majority of them are detransitioning because of lack of support from their family and community. There is a small percentage of trans people that people who have transitioned, who realize later on that they're not actually trans and they regret having gone through with that. And as we talked about before, just because it's a small number doesn't mean that these people don't exist. But that's the thing, is that number one, the incidence of people regretting LASIK surgery is significantly higher than the incidence of people regretting, getting gender-affirming care and transition. Do we ban LASIK surgery? No.
So it's my view wouldn't be banned. Just to be clear to everyone watching, my view isn't ban. It's just like, if that is an issue and you see that specifically there's irreversible things that are done to females versus males using those traditional definitions and split from man and woman, then maybe there's a reason to have that separation. But I do appreciate where you come from.
Yeah, and forgive me, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I'm just saying that, like, speaking to the broad audience of people who are surely out there saying that, like, we need to get rid of all this stuff. We need to ban gender-affirming care and things like that. Like, there's pretty much every medical intervention has a regret rate to it, and most of them we would consider acceptable. And so what it really boils down to is, if somebody regrets or wants to detransition or something like that, they are going to need very specialized and very specific medical care, and they should have access to it. People who are transitioning also require very specific, very specialized medical care, and they should have access to it. Anybody in any particularly weird situation is going to require specific and specialized medical care. And so, like, we shouldn't be treating this situation any differently than any other situation. And indeed, I don't think that doctors do. It's only when we have this debate and say, well, what if one day you decide that you want to be a boy again, or want to be a girl again, or want to be this or that? It's like, you wouldn't do that in any other situation. So there's really, I don't think, any reason to do it now. I think it's patronizing to say, well, you're going to regret it someday. I think you might, so you don't get to make this decision. Even with children, we have ways of making sure that they make that decision properly.
Why is Forrest so positive about everything on the subject of gender-affirming care, even to the point of assigning it to the youth? It is quite hard to find information on the subject that doesn't seem biased. If I Google this, I find gendergp.com article that claim 99.7% success rate on surgeries, which seem a bit high. On the other hand, I can find interviews of gender clinic workers that are not so happy about their work.
The kids put on the puberty blockers, mental health was getting worse once they started the blocker. And that's against what the narrative tells us. The narrative says these interventions are supposed to make people better. And what we were seeing was parents calling and saying, my child has had the blocker in for a month. They're crying every day. They've had the blocker in for 3 months and they're now failing out of school. Things that were supposed to be getting better were getting worse. In the center that I worked in, I started there when we were still supposed to be operating under the WPATH guidelines, standard of care 7, which had some age kind of ideas for when people were supposed to start hormones. WPATH 7 was supposed to be 16, and it said only in rare and kind of urgent cases should you be under the age of 16. We were pretty much putting anybody on testosterone at 13 and a half if that's what they wanted, and they got to us in time.
And what does that do to you if you are a young person who's been given testosterone?
So,
young girl.
Well, it depends. So if you
young
were
female assigned at birth, sorry.
Well, no, even if you were given a blocker first,
okay,
and we blocked you and then put you on a cross-sex hormone, we are potentially basically causing you to be infertile for life. And testosterone, the effects that kids reported that they wanted happened pretty quick. So we would permanently affect your voice, and your voice would be dropped into a male pitch. You would see growth on your clitoris into what we would refer to as a micro penis. We would start seeing atrophy, and your vaginal canal would start to have atrophic features. All of your body fat would start to move and shift around. You would have facial hair growth. A lot of our patients would start losing the hair on the top of their head. And then we would see mood changes. We would see patients who were, again, they were supposed to be getting better. Their mental health was supposed to be getting better. A lot of times it was not doing what we thought it was going to do. Yes, that's what I came to finally understand, that maybe out of our huge number of patients, there were a few patients that this model of care maybe helped, but it was getting to the point where we were harming more patients that we were helping, just by the numbers.
So I will make some work by making some deductions that I am pretty sure about. I can imagine this working for adults, but children are a complete different story. Child is still developing, so they can't know where they will land. Some people claim that they knew from very young age that they should transition. Well, did they know it? Or are they saying after the fact that when it happened to work for them? When you are young, expressionable, and insecure about your place in the world, I claim you can't know if transition would be good for you. So, in a sense, we are throwing a dice when children are concerned. Bad roll of the dice can have dire consequences. On the other hand, there are people whom the transition probably would be best to do at young age. How can we find out whom this does work for? I don't think we can. Forrest's so confident that people can find out about this, but when there are so flimsy variables on play, various people, their biases and beliefs, there is no way you can confidently say that everyone will do a good job. After all, the ones taking patients have financial benefit in accepting as many patients they can. So how can you vouch for people you don't know to not cut corners for better pay?
For like a 30-minute session to talk about it. And I essentially walked in, I said, I identify as transgender and I want to get top surgery. And we chatted for a bit, maybe for half an hour. And at the end of the session, she wrote me an approval letter to send to my insurance. And then I got approved just like that.
When you first started, you went in, you said to Planned Parenthood.
Yes.
And they gave you testosterone immediately.
Yeah, I essentially just made a phone call and said, I want to transition. And it was immediately given. I got a prescription and went to pick it up like a week later.
Did they ask you questions? Did they do any psychological testing? Did they ask you why? What was your motive?
It was completely self-diagnosed. Well, self-diagnosed. I claimed that I had gender dysphoria and I wanted to transition, and they didn't really ask me any questions about it. I just called them and I said, when can I get this? And they just said they needed to write me a prescription for it and send it. And that's essentially
you had no proof that you were gender
dysphoria.
You didn't.
Yeah, I didn't talk to anyone about it. Nobody medically professionally. I had just looked up. I did some like trans research, I guess, into the transgender community and everybody online, and they just seemed so happy and successful. And at the time, I didn't see any information on detransition or any like the negatives about it. And so I kind of got completely wrapped into that.
Gender dysphoria can be a miserable way to live if that's what they're experiencing. And there are criteria for that. And one of the criteria is time, that is persistent across time. But you didn't have any of those criteria. You didn't demonstrate that. You didn't document that. You didn't have any professional that documented that.
Nope.
You said, I want testosterone. They gave it to you.
Yeah, I had confused, because I had become uncomfortable with how society had seen me as a woman sexually. And I had confused that being uncomfortable with my gender as gender dysphoria and being uncomfortable with my body. So I didn't actually have gender dysphoria. I had just confused myself into thinking that I did.
I was working with an executive on one case of assessment of a young person, and the executive member agrees to refer this person to the medical pathway within the first hour of meeting him.
And that is not supposed to happen?
Absolutely, it should never happen, because this is a pathway that will lead to huge changes for this young person. You know, it could lead to, potentially, infertility and so on.
I find Forrest's confidence on this topic absolutely horrifying. He constantly say, we, when talking about this. Is he benefiting from this financially and making a marketing speech? Well, I don't know the numbers, and linking all the things I found don't seem useful since I don't know the reliability of any study for or against. And yes, I could find both. So I don't know the number, but I do know there is a number of young people who would have developed normally and are instead crippled thanks to unnecessary interventions. And I remain cautiously horrified what that number could be. For the next part, I will need to play a very long clip, but there is a point to this. The interaction is quite fascinating.
I'd like to move firmly onto gender. So maybe this will be a good question to start with. What is a social construct and how does it apply to gender?
The simple basis of it is that gender cannot be boiled down to, nor can it be predicted by sex.
Sex can't predict gender at all, eh?
They are just simply different things. And so gender roles, gender expression, whatever, gender expectations vary from culture to culture, from generation to generation, from person to person, and from day to day. What gender actually is an individual's reflection and performance of what they and what their culture around them expects from their perceived biological sex. That's generally speaking the way that it's defined. But again, in gender diverse cultures, like say, for example, Twin Spirits and Native Americans, that isn't always the case, because you get to a certain point where you grow up and you say, actually, you know what? I'm finding out a bit more about myself. I've done some internal searching here, and this isn't working for me. I'm going to go ahead and act this way. And everyone goes, right, cool, your life, you do what you want to do. And that's how it should be. So that's what we mean by social construct, and that's what we mean by gender. It's something that is tangential to sex, and maybe even a little bit related and touches on sex. It's
Only touches it a little bit.
but it's not predictable by sex, and it's not the same thing as sex, and it varies quite a bit depending on your culture and also just who you are.
Too much bullshit even for Steven to take.
So when you say it's not predictable by sex, do you mean are you on the one hand saying that it heavily correlates with sex, but sex isn't a necessary condition, or are you saying that sex doesn't predict it at all?
In the same way that it's simply not true to say everybody with XY chromosomes is a male and everybody with XX chromosomes is a female, that is just patently false. It is also not true to say everybody with XY chromosomes is a boy and everybody with XY chromosomes is a girl or a man or a woman. Man, woman, girl, boy, these are gendered terms. Male and female are sex terms, and they don't correlate 100% of the time. That happens, they're a little bit more fuzzy than that. And gender in and of itself is very much spectral and very much fluid and could vary even within one individual person quite a lot.
Notice Forrest didn't answer the question at all. Steven thinking how to direct the question so he can get the answer he is expecting, so they don't seem completely clueless.
Okay, so let me approach it this way then. If someone was to say that someone's gamete type doesn't always tell you what their gender is, but it's a fair inference to make it's a fair thing to make an inference from until you have better information. Is that, in that case, are they not using it as a prediction? So because so many people they can't tell what your gamete type is, but you get the idea, right? Like, suppose they could, they know what your gamete type is, they've got your 23andMe, they're looking at your chromosome.
The weight and pressure of asking this question yet again is setting Steven on a path of diplomacy. He wants to avoid being rude and trying to lighten up this situation.
It's chromosomes, gamete type, this is already bizarre to me, but like, suppose they've got that information, they could probably, would you think it's fair to say that they can make an inference about you're probably a man if you fit these categories?
In a really, really bizarre set of circumstances, yeah, maybe you could
In some weird, bizarre circumstances, this guy doesn't live in real world.
Make an inference, and that inference would be right maybe 60% of the time. And
60% of the time? If you know the biology of someone to the chromosomes and gametes, you think you can predict their gender only 60% of the time? So it is almost 50-50 if a male ends up identifying as a man and female ends up identifying as a woman?
It'd be cool or whatever like that. But like, the thing you have to remember, it would be the same thing as, if I see the type of car you're driving, the type of music you're listening to, and the type of news you're watching, I can probably make an inference into who you voted for in the last election. But that's not always going to work, you know what I mean?
And immediately trying to divert attention away from this.
And so like, the thing is that's really important to remember is that when it comes to gender, I am a cisgendered man. I am a man, and I use he, him pronouns, and I consider myself a man, and I exhibit what a lot of people consider masculine characteristics some of the time. I can't freaking tell you what masculinity is or I don't think of myself as a man most of the time. I think of myself as Forrest. I'm just me. And so like, I don't really associate myself with masculinity or with manhood or with, being a man in my culture. It doesn't really resonate with me, and I'm not particularly interested in exploring it. It's not my vibe. And that's very different from the cisgendered man across the street from me who drives a big motorcycle that's loud and a big red truck in his driveway and blasts rock and works out and has a beard and all these other things that like is important to him as a man. There's no shame in that. I'm not mocking that, but like, that's his expression of maleness and manhood to him, and mine is very different. And that's what we talk about when we talk about gender performance. Gender isn't just something that you have or something that you are. It's something that you do. It's an expression. It's something that you're constantly engaged in. And it's very different even within cis people. My concept of manhood and masculinity, I guarantee, is different than yours. And yet we're both men.
I fail to see how gender expression has any relevance to the question. Is driving a big muscular car a new gender now? And if you read books, that is another gender? Is gender just description what you are like? I began this video by saying gender is useful, but not if it is used like this. There is no way to create enough descriptive gender words to express all the behavior variations.
Like, that money is a good example to get people's mind into what a social construct is. Another one is marriage. So marriage is a social construct. It's just society's decided, yep, you're together, you get extra rights, you get to do this, you get to do that.
I totally agree about social constructs, but I think more interesting discussion is about what these social constructs are based upon. When you say that these are completely made up, that is not entirely true. These constructs are not arbitrary and did not come randomly out of nothing. Just some food for thought.
So what by your lights is a woman?
I would say any person with the internal sense of femininity that pervades and defines their personality and their perception of themselves. It's not circular to say that there are feminine characteristics that we associate with womanhood, and if someone exudes those feminine characteristics and it senses those feminine characteristics, that they would fit into the box of womanhood. It's important to mention when you talk about those things that this is something that is self-identified. You can't say, you are X amount of feminine, therefore I now call you this thing. Like, any more than you could look at me and say, okay, well, looks like, I got my decibelometer and your voice is just loud enough and just deep enough, I'm going to call you a man now. It's just not how it works.
So I think this might be a disagreement between us. So it'd be interesting to see what you think of my position, because it's always good to get criticisms. It seems to me that if you're going to sign off on something being a social construct, you are saying there that there are conditions that need to be approximately met to be considered part of that, whatever that social construct is. So when I think of a woman, I would probably give a definition like this. A woman is someone who lives up to the social construct, it changes per society, that's heavily associated with secondary sex characteristics, behaviors, and aesthetics. But by saying that, and recognizing that it changes per culture, so really it depends on the culture, by saying that, someone does actually have to fit approximately that definition, which means that you can't just self-identify. So it seems that my position has it so that self-identification, and by my position I mean like the one that I think has got good utility, this is the one that I sign off on when it comes to gender. Whereas your view seems, if I'm understanding correctly, would entail that if I told you I was a woman, then I am a woman. Is that fair?
No. So I get where you're coming from, and I'm going to speak both to and against your point, because I think you and I agree a lot more than we don't here on that. The major distinction I would say is the very last thing you said is like, if you tell me you're a woman, that does not make you a woman. If you are having that internal sense of being a woman, and you have that internal femininity and like those things, and you're expressing that to me, you're telling me you're a woman has no bearing on whether or not you are. It's just you're letting me know.
Based on Forrest's definition of a woman, he is one of the people who are saying that people can just declare themselves as women. No one is saying this, eh?
Men just become women by just declaring that they are, and then the other guy's like, that's clearly delusional. It's like, yeah, that's why nobody's saying any of that. Nobody's making those arguments.
Well, I already found one. You don't accept Steven as woman just if he just says so because he needs to express it? Well, are you a mind reader? Basically, anyone who can act any amount can get through your filter. So it is not much different than declaring that you are a woman. And I want to see you arguing with someone how you think they don't express their womanhood well enough. They will call you a transphobe. How do you like that then?
And like, what are you doing then?
Be prepared to taste your own medicine. You have set yourself up for embarrassing failure in the future. What a clueless person.
How embarrassing.
Luckily, Steven will help me out explaining one other issue with this attitude.
But the problem is that a definition that has nothing in it at all. There's nothing that you've got to live up to. There's no expectations. There's no aesthetics. There's no behavior. There's no associations. Nothing. It doesn't tell you anything. And so the category is completely pointless. And for one, that's a really serious problem with utility. You've just deleted what it means to be a woman. Now, some people would say that that's actually a good thing, because the whole point of feminism is to remove any kind of expectations and aesthetics and stuff like that. But a lot of people would go, no, you do need to still have the space between a man and a woman. And if you're going to do that, you are going to be in the business, be it through referring to necessary conditions or a social construct or what have you. As soon as you start signing off on a definition, you're going to necessarily be making it so that some people won't fit that definition, but that's okay, kind of thing. So I do recognize your objection, but I worry that actually the self-identification position itself just has, like, there's nothing else where we do self-identification apart from names, really. Like, we wouldn't do it with castles. Would we? Is there others? Please let me know.
I would disagree with you on that, and I would disagree with you for this reason. If you take two cisgendered men, I talked a minute ago about like my perception of masculinity and yours. So like, take two cisgendered men and ask them, what does it mean to be a man? What does a man do? Not your internal perception. What is the societal expectation of a man? Different cultures, different people, different generations, different days. You're going to get different answers. I think, yeah, having it as an internal thing, it does make it a little bit fuzzy and kind of weird and flowy. And by definition, is it a social construct? It is, necessarily spectral, but that doesn't reduce its utility. The culture is still there and the culture still exists. The question is, are you going to respect me as a person and treat me the way that I want to be treated? Or are you going to say, I grew up with this understanding of how you're supposed to act and therefore you need to do these things? And whether or not you include trans people or gender identification and understanding, if you take all of that out of the debate, you have the exact same conundrum, which is just respect.
Just because you might get some different answers, it doesn't mean we have nothing common or that we have no answers. These categories didn't universally pop up in every society on planet randomly. It is like saying we don't know everything, therefore we know nothing. Universally, men are the ones waging war. I've never heard of culture where femininity meant bearing arms. So there is biological pressure for these categories. Every exception you can find doesn't mean we know nothing and throwing everything away. And again, gender expression is not gender, right? Just because you have different societal expectations doesn't mean you have a different gender, does it? Forrest has constant, complete confusion with these terms. Or maybe he is being consistent, but is working under some model I don't know about. He did say gender is what you do, so does he think there are infinite amount of genders? but you never even name a single gender for these behaviors. I simply don't get it.
Just respect.
Speaking of respect, if only self-identity is required, the women's toilets can have someone like this walk in.
Oh, blimey. That was my last match!
Looks like you need a hand. Do you need a light?
I've heard of so many women say that they feel vulnerable and exposed when a male enters their spaces. They hear this voice,
do you need a light?
And they freeze. Their instincts scream to them, that is a man. So why is this respect a one-way street? These women can't help but feel it. They can tolerate it, but it sure will feel uncomfortable for them. Some probably will call them bigots for feeling that way, but that is deep within. They don't choose to feel that way, but their feelings are completely ignored. They are told to stop being what they are. Override your natural instincts with your rational thoughts. Do it. Do it now.
Do it.
Forrest gives all his sympathy and empathy for the few, while completely ignoring the plight of the many. Even the they and their pronouns. Utility for them is admitted not being good, and Forrest says it is not his call to make, and if trans want to have these pronouns to be used. Again, no consideration for anyone but the trans. Then why is it your call to make that women should just sit there and take it that men can self-identify as women and enter their spaces?
You know what? And then you get right back to the argument of, oh, well, that's such a rare thing. Who gives a shit if it's rare? It's millions of people's lives, and you don't get to tell them what box they're in because it's convenient for you.
There is no conflict.
Oh yeah, there is the caveat of that they need to express being a woman, and then it's okay. But there was no requirement for any changes for voice, looks, or anything else. Even Matt Dillahunty expresses this lack of empathy.
We could have 21 types of bathrooms for 21 genders. We don't.
We could just have one. As you can all pee next to me, I don't care.
Yeah, you don't care who pees next to you. A lot of women do. Are you saying they should just grow out of it? If you want to play that game, then you could just the same tell all the trans people to grow out of their issues if that is the attitude you want to take. It is like, because it is a majority, they just need to roll over and kneel down to the minority. This is exactly what I mean, that self-identity is unworkable. It completely ignores why the identity is there in the first place, because you are not alone. The assumption of self-identity always seemed wrong to me. What good is self-identity if you are alone? The identity is for the other people, not for you. So naturally, other people need to be part of the equation. It sounds so narcissistic that all that matters is your reality, and fuck everyone else if they dare to object. And it may sound like I don't offer empathy for the trans. I do. It must be awful for them. But if one trans that doesn't pass any female checks can go to women's spaces, there can be 20 women who will suffer from it. So my utilitarian within is just baffled that self-identity could be the only check necessary.
That's a funny phenomenon, man. I've seen like people, they just like watch a film and they go, oh, it's woke. And I'm like, oh, why is that? And they're like, there's a black person in it. I'm like, wow, okay. Thanks for telling me that. Now I understand your disposition.
Was the scary black man too close to you? Did you see, oh wow, oh my God. It's
Did someone really say, there is a black person there? Full stop? Usually after that sentence, there should be some more words. Or did you just stop listening at that point? For example, I think Rey from Star Wars was very much woke. When I first saw the movie, I didn't even know the concept of woke. I was very interested to see the first female Jedi. I didn't know how they could go wrong with that. And oh boy, did they waste all that potential. She was better than everyone at everything and even beat Kylo at the end of the first movie with no training and no explanation or even a hint for that power at all. I hate how female characters are completely getting destroyed by social pressures like that.
What is appreciated, however, is Kylo pointing out how weak of a character Rey is. Her only flaw is wanting to meet her parents, and so she gets attached to fathering figures in her life. Other than that, she barely has a fault to speak of. The most unrelatable, perfect, amorphous blob of a character in the long history of film.
I don't particularly like the racial swaps either. Why did our childhood Ariel's race need to be swapped? I would find white Black Panther just as ridiculous. But I would like to see white Black Panther movie made just to see those people's comments then who commented, it's just skin color, what do you care? It's hypocritical, that is my main issue with it. They don't care about skin color until they do. The common trope I hear, and which I agree with, is that they should just create new stories and make them as woke as they want. Why does the remake need to make gender or racial swaps? It just makes it look like a political tool and movies were meant to be fun. Sorry, Steven, but you really straw-manned this one. I don't believe for a second that is the argument for woke movies you have heard. Note that I'm not saying this is impossible. Unlike Forrest, who denies with no hesitation, I can imagine such a person existing who just don't like to see black people in movies. My question is, where did you meet such an alien person?
Also include, I think it's really fucking telling of the mindset as well. If you think that teaching kids that gay people exist is necessarily going to make them be gay, if you think that teaching kids that, different cultures and different ethnicities and different genders exist is going to force them to become those things, you're exposing the fact that you don't know how to not indoctrinate kids. You are speaking from a dogmatic standpoint that I teach my kids to behave this way and so they do. If you teach them options and diversity, they're not going to change as people except for the fact that they're going to be better people. It's not going to force them to be anything. That's what you're doing. You're confusing you with the rest of us.
I'm not just like the rest of you. I'm stronger. I'm smarter. I'm better. I am better.
So what you're saying is, like so many of these topics, it's projection.
Yeah, it's every single accusation is a confession. Absolutely.
Oh my lord, Forrest is so arrogantly naive on this subject. No, of course this is not going to force an individual to become what they are taught to exist. It is a matter of numbers. If you never even give an option, they won't even think about it. If you do, then every kid will be asking themselves which gender they are. Masculine females and feminine males might start to think about transition as their solution. Had they never heard of these options, they might have been just fine with being what they are and having better harmony with their biological makeup. And the scary part is that this is actually you can be certain of if you teach every child in the world about gender options and tell them that they should examine it and freely choose what they are. You are in fact increasing the amount of detransitioners. It won't affect every child, but there is an unknown number of people how many lives this will ruin. And to be fair, there is also a number of people whom this will help. The ones who truly have this condition will be on their better paths very early on. But what I'm saying that the number who this will help is only a fraction of the number whom this will hurt purely based on numbers. Because most people won't need any of this. The problem is not only just transitioners. Normal kids might end up wasting their time with this. It can take surprisingly amount of time to change path. I will talk about this in another video. Kids are not so wise that more information simply makes them better. That is what I mean by Forrest being naive. I would rather teach children stoic virtues rather than gender. But I guess that would be just dogmatic indoctrination. I should not teach my own child. It is the job for Forrest who knows better. I would not object to teaching children about objective reality. Existence of gay people is part of reality. Teaching them about gender options is kind of like young Earth creationist comes to teach your children about some other options as well. Sure, gender can be a useful concept, but not like Forrest has been using it. He confuses it with gender expression all the time. It is like he imagines already that there are 100 genders. You are trying to spread your dogma to children under the guise of just giving people options. What happens when people do get options? People can handle 3 options a lot better than 5. Even more, and it will get overwhelming very quickly. You learn this from sales. Now you come along and teach them about all of these options, and expect them to just become better people. The confusion and burden you are laying down on these children will be huge.
When I first got into working with teen girls, I was sure that we were going to spend a lot of time talking about crushes. It's like, that's vanished. I mean, the energy that used to go toward having feelings for other people and being nervous about that and excited about that has gone toward having feelings about who am I as a gender identity.
Most people would naturally fit in the 2 categories we have had so far, and giving them options will make most of them completely confused. What is better or a better person is also subjective. If better means becoming weird hippie like you, then I suppose you might be right to teach them about these things. If better means forming productive family unity, then I think you are wrong. Many people in the face of all these options can waste so many years going towards paths that won't bring them long-term happiness or satisfaction of creating a legacy. You are driving them away from the more natural path by laying down these options. Another aspect to this is that trying to transition is an awful battle against biology. You'll be medicalized for the rest of your life. Activists often cite suicide statistics, but doesn't all of this mean that we actually should indoctrinate our children to be the same gender as their biological sex? Wouldn't that be the most humane thing to do? And yet the talking point from activists is always that children should examine their gender. Why? If the other option is path to lifelong medication and sterilization. Why the fuck would you even give that option for a child to think about? A complete contradiction if the goal is welfare. For me, it makes logical sense to only let them discover that when they are older. That would be the true test who actually has gender dysphoria and who are simply influenced by Forrest's indoctrination camp of misery. For a lot of people, creating a family is what will bring them long-term fulfillment. But anyway, I suppose it depends on what is the goal. But the fact that you are there telling what other people's children should learn under the guise of not telling them your pet theories is dogmatic is absolutely repulsive. Unless it is clearly harmful, I'm even reluctant to even tell religious people how they should bring up their children, no matter how I disagree with their views. Check your bias.
All you're showing is that you are incapable of stepping outside of your own heuristics for even a second to check to see if you have any biases or check to see if you're actually wrong.
Clear that I'm perfectly happy for people to have these toys and to play with them at home and hug them to themselves and so on and share them with other people who come around and play with the toys. So that's absolutely fine. They are not to make me play with these toys. Okay? I will not play with the toys. Don't bring the toys to my house. Don't say my children must play with these toys. Don't say my toys might be a condom. Here we go again. I'm not allowed by their toys. I'm not going to have any of that. Enough with clerical and religious bullying and intimidation. Is that finally clear? Have I got that across? Thank you.
I think that one of the concerns is that if you go with something too broad, you're just going to eliminate females, if you will, use that definition. You're going to eliminate them from a lot of things. So if you take like the female who runs the fastest 100 meters, her time is beaten by 100 male students in like universities or colleges in the US. And this isn't a surprise to those that are really interested in sports because testosterone does a lot. Like the hemoglobin in the blood is really important. You get fast twitch muscle fibers. Like just as the UFC has decided, look, weight category is really important when it comes to fighting, so we're going to grade it on this. Otherwise, you're just going to see a big guy beat the crap out of a small guy 80-90% of the time. In lots of sports, they have recognized that testosterone, which is to say something that heavily correlates and typically is spread across the sexes, is that important. So this is one of those ones that's difficult, and I appreciate, we said our bit and we can move on, but like, I think that this is one of the key pinnacle topics that's brought up all the damn time by people because it's just so central to the broader conversation that's happening with trans people. And I fear that people who do have that view, where they don't necessarily care about sports and they think, hey, just let everyone compete, it will actually lead to the elimination of females in sports pretty much across the board. And that will give such a piece of utility towards the transphobic view that people might vote differently because of that one issue alone, because it's so present and obvious. But hey, another area we disagree.
No, I can definitely see where you're coming from, and like you make some fair points, and I get where I'm smelling what you're stepping in here. But I think the biggest thing for me is like and again, cannot stress this enough. I am not the person to ask about this. if I was looking at what you were just talking about, if I were an athlete, which I am very not, then my main concern would be just like competing. I want to do my best, and I want to see where I rank up. And if I don't rank up high enough, I want to try harder. And so let's say, for example, in some you pick your favorite thing where like there is a true dichotomy of like performance between genders. And so like
powerlifting.
Sure. And so say like the strongest possible women in the women's division actually are lifting a little more than the weakest possible men in that division. Wouldn't it be worth it as an athlete to rank up even two more spots? And you still have a strongly gendered division of the spec up, like of the weight or of the rankings of the scores. But there's that little bit of interplay in the middle there that makes it a little bit more worth it for like the most competitive among them or the most capable among them. I can see how that, I would make the argument, if I was that kind of person, if I was an athlete, that I want that opportunity to excel, and that's all that matters to me. And I would consider it patronizing to say, well, you play with your group over there and don't come up here with us. And like, that's how I would see it. But like, maybe, athletes have a different opinion, and maybe that's, I don't know. I'm a reading guy.
No, I totally get it.
I'm not to grill Forrest too much on this issue, since he admitted not being the one to ask about this. I still do find the solution he came up baffling. You really want to enter competitions where you know before you even start that you will be dead last every time? There probably won't be many females competing, and you're competing against odds you can never surpass. The top athletes can earn money for their efforts. I wonder how the bottom ranks would get any sponsorship. Maybe there could form an underdog cheering section, but it would create a natural sex division anyway, or simply females would not compete. Imagine if we had Kryptonians on this planet. Do you think it would be patronizing if you didn't compete with Kal-El? In Kryptonian ranking, you can beat the weakest Kryptonian baby, and you are not ranked dead last. It is an accomplishment, right? I don't know. It doesn't sound very attractive prospect for the athletes. I will start to wrap this up. I will end with one of the most telling pieces that I found from this exchange. One that informs so much of the trajectory one's thinking might go towards. a mistake I can fully write my name under in the past. And this one comes from Stephen.
I totally agree. It's a sad irony that those that claim to have moral supremacy are always on the wrong end of history when it comes to these movements. And then they have the audacity, the gall, to claim that, listen, Western civilization wouldn't be this good if it wasn't for the fact that it was predicated on our beliefs. It's like, we're fighting against you the whole fucking time. Like, come on.
And you know,
unbelievable.
Because you all remember all the stuff we learned about history, how, like, before the Bronze Age, everybody was raping and murdering and stealing and lying. And then we learned that that was wrong. And then we stopped doing that. Yeah, of course.
That's the one.
This is exactly one of the blind spots I believe most smart people have in the modern times. All of the new ideas are better than those barbaric ideas of the Bible, or even just 100 years ago, right? We have come so far, and every time the ones who were against progress were on the wrong side of history. So isn't it to be expected that when we keep expanding freedoms and eroding all the norms and traditions we have, we will always be on the right side of history? I've come to believe that is not necessarily true. No matter how stupid and barbaric some of the traditions were, the end result has culminated into something pretty extraordinary. Think of this in a longer time period. It has been positive so far. There is no reason it will continue forever. The thing about new ideas are that most of them suck. The old were tested with a lot of trial and error. I predict the problem is that many of these new ideas go against too many of our innate instincts. It creates a constant strain on the mind that works like a slow poison. Times used to be harder, but depression is an all-time high in the modern times. We are not built to live like this, and technology is also to blame for that. You will start to see more and more evidence of this in time. A lot of things sound good if you rationally think about it, like communism. I believe erosion of gender roles also fits into this category. Do we wither out, or is there going to be a violent backlash? Hard to say. Then again, artificial intelligence can change the calculations completely and make all this pondering meaningless. We live in interesting times is an understatement of the century. But that is all for now. See you next time in Flamethrower Light.
Dogma is the dangerous bit, and it doesn't just exist in religion. It exists in more and more places now, that cultism, that which shouldn't be questioned. Anything that, you know, that's what you want to question. If someone says you shouldn't question this, oh, you've got to question it. You've got to question it.
I was going to say, Richard,